Hi, Joyce.
Hello. Hi.
How are you? It's lovely to see you.
I'm good. I have only one kitty here.
Ah,
Lilith is here, but I don't know. I don't know where Zanchi is. She's hiding, I guess.
lingering somewhere around the house. I've seen from recent pictures of your summer garden that you've been posting on your social media and the tomato plants that you've been growing. I was wondering, are you a very keen gardener?
Oh, I'm not a keen gardener. I love to garden, but it's a very small garden. I'm sitting at my study on the second floor of
Mhm.
my house, and I'm actually overlooking about the entire garden, and I can. It's not that large.
So
What
see
about you?
well, I have a small garden out back in our from our flat, which is very nice and yeah, has lots of flowers and but I have a sort of strange relationship with gardening in that I grew up in Maine in a very rural area, and my father was always a very keen gardener, and he had quite a large garden. So he grew all sorts of vegetables and fruit and also flowers and I think I have a slight lingering resentment from being sort of forced to go out into the garden with him and spend like a long day gardening when it was very
Yeah.
hot and laborious and so I mean I do enjoy being in a garden, but doing it myself I don't enjoy quite as much.
It's sort of an emotional thing where if you had to really do it for work, the way farmers do,
Hmm.
it's not very romantic.
Hmm.
And then there's so much anxiety about being a farmer because no matter how much work you do, something always goes wrong. The weather goes wrong, or there are insects or
Yeah,
something. So
exactly, yeah.
whereas
um
for people like us, if we're mostly reading or writing, getting out in the garden is such a lovely contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's wonderful where I live. There's a quite a large park just 5 minutes down the road, and within that park there's this enclosure of a flower garden, which has these sort of walls around it. It's this very like romantic sort of old English space, sort of filled with lots of flowers. And there's all these corners with benches where, and often I'll go walking there and I'll see lots of
Yeah.
readers like sat at these benches reading. And it's just, yeah, this very
Uh,
tranquil space.
when I went to London more regularly, I would stay in a lovely small hotel near Kensington Gardens.
Oh,
And
yes.
so I would walk in Kensington Garden quite a bit, really envision it very vividly. For quite a while, like 4 years, I would go to that hotel, but I've actually forgotten the name of the hotel.
But I also see that you've been maybe going out a bit more and not only seeing more people, but also going to art galleries and other places. So has it felt
Uh,
good to be able to travel again?
yes, I think so. I've been to New York once, actually twice.
Mm.
And I'm going to be going to Santa Fe on Sunday with a friend who
Um,
has he rents a house in Santa Fe every year. So I'm staying there for 1 week. I
mm.
must say, flying on the plane, though, is nothing I'm looking forward to.
No,
It's
I'm
a
quite
long,
nervous about it too. Yeah, actually, I was just talking with Edmund White earlier this week. We had a chat and a catch up, and he said that soon he's going to be going to Italy at the beginning of August. And I mean, he's someone who thrives so much on traveling and visiting lots of places. So I think it's a good thing for him. But yeah, it does make me quite nervous, like the thought of doing it again.
well, and I haven't seen Edmund in a while, but he does have a little trouble walking. So I
Mm,
wonder how he'll do that.
yeah.
Walking through an airport is it's quite a long walk usually.
Yeah, it's always a arduous, yeah, sort of long journey to get to wherever it is you need to get to.
And I'm not leaving the territorial United States, so
Yeah, it's easier to fly within the United States. Yeah.
I'm going to this part of the world which I wrote about in the
Yes.
novel, which is so strange because here I'm going back to that part of the world. It's a landscape almost, it's almost an eerie, forbidding landscape in the novel.
Hmm.
But Santa Fe is a place I know. When I wrote about a place like Santa Fe, but it wasn't quite as as tourists, much of a tourist attraction as Santa Fe. And so I kind of reinvented Santa Fe as if it had other qualities to it, but essentially it's that setting. It's so different from the east of the United States or from England.
Absolutely, yeah, it's so striking, and yeah, like you said, sort of eerie, sort of, yeah, bleak landscape, in that there's just so much space. You can see so far into the distance, and it's so flat, and yeah. And well, the setting was what I one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about, like regarding this novel as well. But I just want to give a brief summary first as well for anyone who hasn't read it yet. So the story concerns Michela and Gerard, who are a couple that temporarily move from their home in Cambridge, Massachusetts to New Mexico to take residency at a distinguished academic institute. And they consider this trip to be like the honeymoon that they never had time to experience when they first married 12 years ago. But when Gerard becomes terminally ill, Michela's life spirals into chaos, and she's left alone, struggling to continue in this very stark environment, which is very alien to her. And so yeah, I did find it really striking, the setting of this novel, because it is so very unusual for you to locate your novels anywhere but New England or New Jersey. And so I was wondering what inspired you to place the story here.
Well, I guess the short answer is that the experience that's in the novel, that's sort of the inspiration, took place in a landscape like that. It's not literally about my husband's death, but it's sort of the aura and the landscape and the setting. I'm very sensitive to settings, and I find that a place has some sort of spiritual or emotional resonance. Is to see the vividness of the external world is sometimes almost overwhelming to me. You know, that the world actually exists. Sometimes I encounter people, they could be writing students of mine, who have conceptual minds, and they might be really majoring, say, in molecular biology, but they're taking a course in writing because they also like to write, but they don't really seem to see anything. So when they write, the world is kind of blank. Their stories or fiction will take place in a kind of nullity. So I would say to them, well, where are these people? What do they see? And people who are conceptual, have conceptual minds, I guess, they don't really see things, or they don't make it a priority to see. It's more like they're thinking. So everything is sort of filtered through thought. But I'm very mesmerized by the actual world, the visual world. So sometimes I feel that the setting almost comes first. Some things happen in some settings, and some people in some settings. Mm-hmm. Like I felt that strongly about everything I've written set in Detroit. Mm-hmm. It's very much a Detroit story. And anyone who's from Detroit will know what I'm talking about. Like I say, well, that really is a Detroit story, or that's a Michigan story because of the flat landscape or something like that. Mm-hmm. Whereas people who are not from that landscape, they don't probably sense, they don't exactly know that, but maybe the emotion is conveyed. Maybe that's why I like the writing of Thomas Hardy so much, and D.H. Lawrence, and of course Dickens and Faulkner, because the physical world is so evoked. In Hemingway, we have a physical world that's very impressionistic, and it's not evoked very visually, but like the hills like white elephants is given that sort of metaphor, you know, like what do the hills really look like? Well, they look like white elephants. And then the Hemingway character says, well, they don't really look like white elephants, you know. So it's like we don't know what they really look like, but we know what they are like in metaphor. It's kind of a long answer to your question, but the same story could not have been written anywhere else. I wouldn't have been able to write that.
Very, very tied, yeah, to that location. And it leads to some very vivid descriptions of the environment. And I was struck by a line where you write, skies of sharp chiseled clouds wounding to the eye. And like you said, it seemed to be really reflecting the psychology of the characters, how this environment is being perceived. And I always feel that there's no other author can write about the skies and the shifting weather like you can. I mean, it's a very striking aspect of your fiction, and I mean also in your journals, where you'll often just sort of note sort of a perception you have about the sky that day, and I find these passages surpassingly beautiful. And I wonder, when you're contemplating the story you want to write, or are imagining certain scenes, are you often out sort of looking at the sky or at nature?
Well, I probably am. I spend a lot of time walking and running. I just love open fields with wildflowers in them. I somehow feel very mesmerized by that. But then the characters kind of arise too, and they belong in certain settings. And there's a sort of drama, some kind of drama arises between the relationship between the people. So when Makala and Gerard come from the east, they're actually coming from Cambridge, Mass, rather than Princeton. And they come west to this new place where they don't really know anyone. To them, it's almost like going through the looking glass into another world. And the first thing that you notice in an elevated landscape is that you're breathing very quickly. So your senses are kind of alert, but in an almost too alert, it's almost like you can become panicked. Some people who start to suffer altitude sickness have tremendous sense of panic, and your heart's beating quickly. The altitude here is only about 6,000 or 7,000 feet, I think. So that's not as high as Aspen or elsewhere, which is like 10,000 feet. And I was once in Aspen, and that I was not too long ago in a place called Squaw Valley, which I think is in California. And that was, I don't know, maybe 8,000 feet. But anyway, there, people were given canisters of oxygen.
Wow.
Like, you get like a lemon flavored or raspberry flavored. And that works very well, because you really only need a little more oxygen for your brain, because your brain's not accustomed to the altitude. It would take a couple of weeks to get really accustomed. So when these people from the east come to this, actually it's a fictitious place in New Mexico, the first thing that they notice is that they're disoriented. So that's like the beginning of the encroachment of this other experience, the dissolution of their lives. For one person, he becomes desperately ill, and then the wife is so attuned to him. I mean, she so identifies with him that she also enters into that other dimension with him. I mean, you probably had experiences like this where someone very close to you is in the hospital, and so you spend time at the bedside, which I think of as the vigil. I mean, everybody has these experiences. I know they're universal.
Yeah.
But when you're not there, you feel sort of unreal. Like you should really be at the bedside, but you're outside walking around, or going home or something.
Yeah, because you're so mentally thinking about a person so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it becomes very, very haunting. So when my husband Charlie was in the hospital for about 6 weeks in Oakland, I was actually in Berkeley, and I had to I took a lift back and forth. And sometimes my stepdaughters were there, and one of them might drive. So it was a vigil that went on for about 6 weeks or so. And it was a lot of Makala's experience I just conjoined with my own, like this need to be so tired that you won't lie in bed awake. just get completely exhausted by walking up and down hills. There's so many hills in Berkeley. Like, I mean, we lived on Panoramic Hill, so every time we went up and down from our house, it was like climbing a little mountain, a small mountain.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just walk everywhere that I could and run, and did a lot of that. And I can see it was extremely compulsive. And for a while too, I was also teaching. I was still teaching at Berkeley. And Makala is teaching in Albuquerque. She's teaching once a week.
Mm-hmm.
So I was teaching actually twice a week. And it was sort of a hallucinatory experience, which I have only to shut my eyes and I'm right back in it again. You know, it's like it's never ended, like a loop that just keeps going around. So then one of the I guess psychopathological effects that people have, which I was trying to be faithful to, is you're not looking, I think, voluntarily, but involuntarily around the world, and you're looking for the person you've lost. You don't really know that your eye is doing that. But sometimes when people travel and they're in foreign places, they will see people who look familiar. You see a face that looks a little bit familiar, and the neurons in your brain evidently fire and make you think that you know that person. But you've never seen that person before, but it's a little trick of the brain, I think, meant to comfort.
To sort of impose what you want to see on your viewing.
Yeah, because essentially most of our lives are lived unconsciously, and most of our consciousness is not accessible to us. So we're also, right now, even as we talk, we're also the children we once were, and we're also infants. And there are a lot of parts of us that are inaccessible to consciousness, that are totally, in the automatic nervous system. Paranoia there, xenophobia, fear of other people, fear of people who don't look like us, fear of the unknown, fear of something going wrong with your body, fear of looking at your face and seeing that it's disfigured. All these things are built into us. So Makala actually looks in the mirror and she sort of thinks that part of her face is kind of dissolving, like she's sort of losing her ontological place in the world.
Yeah, it's quite frightening, those sections where you feel like her mental state is becoming so fragmented that she's really not able to see those parts of herself anymore.
I think everybody has these experiences eventually.
And a deeply poignant central question of the story is how we continue on when confronted with the insurmountable reality of death. And you've written about grief from a number of different angles in recent short stories and in your novel, Night, Sleep, Death, the Stars. And I know, as we've discussed this in the past and as you've been talking about it, it's heavily based on the loss of your husband, Charlie. And my sense from reading your fiction about this subject is that grief isn't something we ever overcome, but can try to learn to live with, even though we irretrievably lose a piece of ourselves alongside a person we love. Is that right? Do you think that's accurate?
Yes, obviously we have to keep going. So there's some terms or some protocol, that allows you to keep going. But I think what's so hard for people to grasp is that grief is so particular. Like 600,000 people have died of COVID in the United States alone. And for each of the 600,000 people, more or less, there are 5, 6, 10 people who are grieving them, who miss them, like in their families, or there's certainly one or two. And so these deaths they're both universal and common, and yet they're very specific and painfully particular. That's what seems so, maybe it's tragic and wonderful about our experience as human beings, that there's only one, the one person in the world whom you really love. There's only one Shakespeare, there was only one Picasso, there's only one if you had a pet dog you really loved, there was only one of that, that personality. Even though you can get another dog, you can get another cat, you could marry again, you could meet somebody, but it's not going to be the same person. So there's always something that's lost irretrievably. But at the same time, I mean, none of this sounds very literary, but it's sort of with common sense, I guess. At the same time, we are also in the world to care for people, not just to grieve when we lose them, but I think the caring side of us, like Makala is a teacher, and she's sort of excited when she teaches. At some point, she starts to break down even when she's teaching. I didn't have that experience myself. I always thought, if I can teach my class at like 2 or 3 hours long and really enjoy it and help the students and have a nice relationship so that they have no idea what I'm feeling, then I will feel that I can keep going. So I never really had the experience that she had at some point where she can't even hear the students, or there's like a plexiglass wall.
And she forgets their names and can't really see their faces.
Some of them look like they're different. It's like a nightmare, the nightmare of your teaching, where you're going to a classroom and you don't remember what you're teaching. You don't know where the building is. You don't know who these people are, but that panic, people have panics about taking exams, in classes that they haven't gone to in years. So, but caring for other people, I think, is maybe the solution. Then Makala does, she befriends one of her students, a slightly older student who he looks older too. He's not well. He has a chronic respiratory illness, which I know a bit about. I don't have it, but actually Charlie had that condition too. So it's a condition that it's not fatal, not usually fatal, but it doesn't necessarily progress. It can get worse day after day, and then it can get better. It's a sort of one of these chronic conditions that people live with. But under most normal circumstances with medication, there are many illnesses and respiratory conditions that people can live with. It's not like cancer that's sort of relentless and keeps moving forward. Cancer usually progresses. And so her former student named Simon, is a very nice, interesting person that she befriends, and he likes her very much. He may be in love with her. So he's written a letter to her, which she doesn't read it, but she has it. And she doesn't throw it away. And she sort of thinks, I wanted the reader to think that probably she's going to read that letter, and maybe, though they will not have a marriage or a romantic relationship, they might be very good friends. She might actually help him. He may need someone to take care of him. And she will need someone that she can take care of. I don't give her a cat or a dog, which would drain off some of this desire. I did give Jessamine in Night Sleep, Death in the Stars. She does have a big cat.
Yeah, Mac the knife.
Mac the tomcat. So she sort of had that cat who's not a very nice cat, and everybody says, why don't you get a nice cat? I says, well, no, but this is the cat that came to me. I think that's how we feel about life, that this is the cat who came to me.
Yeah. And I found that aspect of the story of that comes later when Makala has this interaction with the student, inspiring and hopeful aspect to the story. And I thought it was really interesting the way you look at the issue of hope in different ways throughout the novel. And Emily Dickinson famously wrote, hope is the thing with feathers. And in your novel, this line is transmogrified into the line, hope is the poisoned bait, men eat of it and die. And at another point, Makala begrudgingly presents a hopeful attitude and you write that that you have lost faith not only in the cutting edge research, but in faith itself. Yet you register hope in your smiling face, and you reflect hope as in a reflective surface. So I was wondering if you could speak about the meaning of how hope changes for Michela over the course of the novel.
Well, it's so strange because even as you were saying, you started saying what you were saying, I opened the novel and looked for that. And so actually I'm looking at it, you essentially believe nothing, you lost faith in faith itself and so forth, but you register hope. It's so uncanny that, because my novel is over 300 pages long. Anyway, so yeah, I think that life is like you're shaking the dice and tossing the dice every day, like if you're going to live your life, you may as well radiate hope for other people, because why not? I think my mother used to say, or maybe I invented it for my mother in my novel, Missing Mom, that if I can't be happy, I can make other people happy. And I'm not sure whether my mother would ever have said anything like that, but I think she may have felt that. And my grandmother too, like, well, maybe I'm not so happy and I can't be happy, but I can make other people happy. It kind of just lifts the general atmosphere. It's just the sort of thing that's true, looking at these words here. If you've spent time around hospitals, if you've gone through with someone you love chemotherapy and radiation and all the tests and the CAT scans and this and that and the other, this is all so, it's just exactly how I felt, like you believe everything and anything that they tell you. This oncologist will tell you, they'll stand there and tell you what they're going to do, and you believe them. At the same time, you don't believe anything, You can hope, well, maybe. You might joke, donating bone marrow to prolong life, a cleansing of the afflicted very being, hose in the new, begin again with a new immune system. Your life is a half-life anyway, why not seed yourself into the life of another? It's just that you may believe it or not believe it, And she looks at a Navajo rug where the rug has all this interwoven beautiful colors, It's like a puzzle. All of life is such intersection and such possibilities, until as it passes through possibility, it becomes something other than life, and that's called death. So there really isn't any reason why not to have faith in it. The rug is in front of you right now. And this person, I wanted to sort of dramatize in their half an hour together, and they're having tea and she's looking around, that though they're not going to be a romantic couple, she's not going to fall in love with him, but they're very much on the same wavelength.
Yeah.
He's a few years younger than she is, but he's literary. He's got a droll sense of humor. He's not physically well, but he can walk around, he's living alone. There's just enough that they have in common. They could very well have a very rewarding friendship for both of them, not just for him. So I think we meet people in life who we're not going to love or, fall in love with or marry, but there are enough of these people that we can connect with to make life really exciting and worthwhile. And then we can help those people, and maybe they help us, but I think there's a feeling of wanting to help. I give money to animal rescue shelters, and there are people who just go, and I've done it too. You sort of just go to the animal rescue and pet some cats for a few hours. And my stepdaughter, Rowena, who likes big dogs, we go walking, she'll walk a big dog that nobody wants. A big dog that's sort of abandoned in the rescue shelter and is so happy to be taken for a walk. There's sort of these little things you can do piecemeal that really make life kind of exciting, like an adventure.
Mm. It can be an enlivening, yeah, new experience and give it new meaning.
Yeah, and you remember from Night's Sleep to Death in the Stars, the portrait of Hugo was pretty much a portrait of Charlie, the same vividness and the action, the zest for life, which can kind of be contagious. So
Mm.
one can sort of take on the mantle of another person, even though the person is not present.
And I feel like faith also plays a really interesting role in the novel, where Michela seems to be an atheist, as it's remarked early on that she is indulging in the futility of prayer to a God in whom you have never believed, but determined to try all stratagems as a desperate gambler placing numerous bets in the face of catastrophic loss. And she seems to have the almost opposite of a religious experience in this novel, because instead of looking for spiritual comfort in a sort of organized religion, she adopts an idea of the Native American gods she discovers in this region who torment her, like in her mind. And so can you speak about why these figures, particularly Ishtikini, take up such a presence in her feverish imagination?
Well, I invented those gods, and they're considered in the story, they're considered prank gods. They're not really the highest gods. They're kind of gods on another level. Well, we are white people, and the history of white people in the Southwest, well, all through North America, in fact, the whole world, like white people came to that part of the world and basically eradicated the indigenous people. I mean, I can't give the accurate statistics of how many million Native Americans there were, and then how relatively few there are today. The statistics are stunning. So there isn't any good reason why a white person shouldn't be in some way perceived negatively or malevolently if there was an indigenous set of gods in some landscape, let's say the Southwest, if there were really these gods. Now, there aren't probably any gods at all. I mean, we don't really believe that. But if there were some indigenous gods there, they certainly are not going to be friendly toward these malevolent white people. So she's sort of inhaling that, and she didn't even think of it, as tourists don't. I mean, tourists don't think of things like that at all. You can go in a museum in New Mexico and be looking at these artifacts and looking at Spanish conquistadors and cowboy exhibits and so forth. And then you'll come upon a statistic of how the Native Americans who live right there, how they basically were wiped out. And you just sort of feel this sensation of unreality, like, wow, and here I'm standing and I paid like $3 for my ticket and I'm taking pictures with my cell phone. It just sort of comes over you, and why you don't belong there at all. That you're really kind of a horrible species, and like, why are you there? But as individuals, we don't really feel that way because we didn't do anything. I mean, my grandparents came from Europe, and they're not part of the whole American slaveholding class. Like, I'm from immigrant Americans, but yet it's considered that white people in America are involved somehow in, a residue of slavery and the guilt of that. So she's sort of looking at these prank gods, and the gods are not like Christian gods. They're really not nice gods. I mean, we have a tradition of there being a nice God, but Indian religion has many, many gods, and some of them are quite destructive. They're like prank gods. They're tricksters.
Right.
There's a trickster god in Native American. There's always a trickster god. You can't trust the trickster god. And true, in life, you can't trust life.
Mm-hmm.
So Michela is kind of relating to these artifacts are in her house, and sometimes they seem to have gotten out of the closet, and sometimes they moved a little bit. and they're sort of sneering at her. And at the same time, she knows that that can't be happening.
Mm-hmm.
D.H. Lawrence was writing about some of these things. I haven't actually read D.H. Lawrence in quite a while, but he wrote a wonderful short novel called The Woman Who Rode Away. I haven't read it in a while, and I know it's probably horrifically misogynist. It's probably really, really scathingly sexist, but it's probably at the same time quite brilliant, as Lawrence had a way of just sort of going for the jugular. So the woman who rides away, she leaves the white culture, which is stultifying and emasculated, and she goes into the other culture, which is primitive. I'm sure that Lawrence was writing in very archetypal terms, almost like Jungian terms. So the woman she rides away, she's taken away, she's going to give herself up in a sacrifice where her heart will be torn out of her body. It's replicating, I think, the ancient Inca sacrifices. I mean, I'm assuming that everybody who's listening to me speak knows about the ancient Inca and Aztec sacrifices of thousands of people. So I'm not being, I hope, racist in saying that these things took place, because they did take place. So it's not meant to be any kind of pejorative, In fact, I think in one day, sometimes maybe it's thousands of people, 1,000 people, hundreds of people might be sacrificed. Sometimes young children. There was one sacrificial rite, I think it might have been in Peru, where young children were sacrificed, like 1,000 in one day, but also baby llamas, very young llamas. And it's not really known why that was done, but they found all these bones mixed together. The people who did the sacrificing, who were the priests, would have explained to us why they were doing it. I mean, they had a reason.
Yeah, but of course we can't know.
But it's sort of like, why are these crazy things being said in the United States by so many politicians? Like, what is the reason that you're not getting vaccinated? Well, we have reasons, there's always a reason that in itself is sort of crazy. So, all right, sacrificing baby llamas. Okay, we feel that must have been a very angry God that had to be placated. So Macau is kind of in that world that's kind of a glimmer of a primitive world. She's there as a visitor from another world, which is a very educated white culture. And she's actually from the Harvard area, she's in this primitive place. So I think we're all susceptible to that. And also just the physicality of these gods. There's a God, a Jesus, the Sacred Heart of Jesus. They visit in a Catholic church. People in other religions like Judaism, I think, are pretty repelled by the physicality of the primitive Catholic iconography, where you'll have a sacrificial crucified Savior with a bleeding forehead and thorns, and his heart is exposed. I think Judaism, is more of a conceptual religion. It's more like an ethical religion. And Catholicism is more like a sacrifice. It's based on a sacrifice, different physicality. So really, Macau is a little bit repelled by that too. It's not just the gods of the indigenous people. It could be, the white gods as well.
And I guess because the statues that are around her, which probably aren't even authentic, but are these representations, images, and because of her fragile state of mind, she kind of internalizes these, and it starts to work upon her consciousness in this very nightmarish way.
Yes, definitely. I think we feel the vulnerability of so many people when we're vulnerable ourselves. I think the most unrealistic times in our lives are when we feel very confident and invulnerable. People feel sort of brash and audacious, and that sets them a bit apart from other people. But when you feel beaten down and vulnerable, you really connect with other people. There's a real sympathy and empathy.
And I think it's also interesting how the aspect of the story where she also seems to internalize this myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, and the tragedy of this story becomes her own, or at least it becomes one possible outcome of her story. And in connection with this myth, you wrote this line where you said, "What is most human in us will be our curse and will assure our damnation." And I found this so arresting, and it seems to contain a profound and like solemn truth about the nature of life. So I was wondering if you could expound upon what you mean by that, and why this myth has such a presence in the story.
Well, it's a very interesting myth, and so Eurydice is in Hades. I think she's bitten by a poison snake or something, and Orpheus comes to bring her back. But as they're walking, they have to walk single file. They can't walk side by side. She is not alive. She's a shade. So they're walking single file, and he gets the feeling that he wants to check to see if he's behind her. Though he says he speaks to her, but she can't hear him. So he just glances over his shoulder, and then she fades. How do we interpret that? I find that so poetic and powerful. So in my novel, oddly enough, Eurydice is actually Makala. It's as if Makala is the one who's in Hades. And so the figure she thinks might be her husband, he looks at her over his shoulder, and she's a victim of a flash flood. If you hike in the canyons in the Southwest, there are these signs all over: stay out of the canyon if there's a threat of rain. Because the canyons are very steep and the walls are very high. So within about 10 minutes, if there's a cloud burst, the water rises very rapidly and you can drown. You get thrown all around in the canyon. I have certainly been in these canyons on a day when it was a little cloudy, and other people do it too. And you're just sort of thinking, well, it's not going to rain. It's not really going to rain. There's a little patch of blue sky and it's not thundering. The things that we tell ourselves is sort of taking this chance. But if it does rain in a deluge, you're probably going to drown. And it was so easy not to do it. So she's sort of drawn into this. She's looking for she's sort of looking for her husband. She thinks, even though she knows that she has his ashes in her suitcase, still she's sort of looking for him. And the mind sort of plays those tricks. You're sort of looking for this person. Well, who exactly are you looking for? You know that the husband's not there. Well, you're looking for the lifeline who's going to pull you into the future or save your life. You're looking for something you can't name. So it sort of seems like it's that lost husband. But anyway, he turns and looks for her, and then she fades away. However, in the next chapter, Makala reads about it in the newspaper, so we're not sure whether this has really happened.
Which of these is correct? Yeah, and I wanted to talk about your approach to diverging paths in life, because how you handle it in this story, I think, is so interesting, and it seems to be a theme that you've been working on in different fictional forms quite recently in a number of your fiction. Because I also wanted to mention about your recent short story collection, The Other You, and because it's so fascinating how you write about these issues where, and I'm sure everyone can relate to how so often we can become lost in contemplating what our lives would have been like if we'd made different decisions, or if a certain life-changing occurrence hadn't happened to us. And many of these stories in this collection feel almost like cautionary tales to not become too consumed with regret and longing for what we can't have, because we've made or been subjected to other choices in our life. And the opening and closing stories in this book seem so personal to you as an author, as they alternately concern a character who wants to become a famous author and a figure who is a famous author. And so I was wondering if you could speak about how these two stories came about, and why you chose to position them at the beginning and end of this collection.
Well, it's a very good question. And the stories are sort of arranged very definitely in that collection. But the places Lockport, as I told you at the beginning of our conversation, that setting is very important to me. So it's like sometimes I call it Uville, it's Lockport, New York, and there was a bookstore there, and I might very easily have just stayed in that area. I lived out in the country, but I was often in this little city, a small city of about 30,000 people, really quite small. And then at the end, the protagonist comes back again to Uville, and she's visiting a library there. I went back. I mean, I was invited back after about 36 years of being away, and it was the library who invited me back. Wonderful, wonderful library. If I'd known that we were going to talk about this, I could run and get a picture of this beautiful Lockport Public Library that was so important in my life. I mean, it's sort of like a real, like a cathedral in my imagination. And so they actually hosted me in a theater, because the library wasn't big enough, but the library and the theater were close by. But in my story, of course, it's more of a funny story, and I didn't want it to be a boastful story, but in real life, I had a huge audience, and many people were there from my grade school and my middle school. You know, a lot of people were there whom I hadn't seen in many, many years. So it was kind of a wonderful experience. But
yeah, it must have been so moving.
But I couldn't write. I mean, I did write about that in nonfiction, but I wrote about it in an essay. But in the fiction, I wanted to take a darker cast. Like, there's one person in the whole world who really loves her and has saved all her books. He's collected it's in his house. He bought this special house. He's in this wheelchair and he's at her. And he's totally unexpected. She doesn't expect that there's going to be this person who remembers her from 7th grade. But there he is, you know, like, that is not totally implausible. You could go back to your hometown, somebody you knew in 7th grade who had a crush on you, who always really liked you a lot and hasn't forgotten you, is still living there. And he's collected all your books. And will you please come just to see his house, you know? So that's kind of the end of the story. And I wanted to be kind of ambiguous, because what exactly is she going toward? And then there's even her limousine is following slowly behind the two of them. It looks like a hearse, you know, it's sort of black and shiny. And like at the same time, it's like this person in Makala's class who has a respiratory condition. Maybe that person who's not altogether well is a person that you can help because you're still healthy. You know, like, maybe she'll end up staying in Uville with this person in the wheelchair. Maybe she'll just realize that, why not? He loves me, and I guess I probably could love him. You know, just the fact that somebody loves us and regards us highly, sometimes that's enough to make us consider them much more highly. And you think, well, maybe I will never fall in love with him, but I could come to love him. I could come to be very fond of him. He become my best friend. Like maybe she's actually going to stay there with him. So there are these alternative lives. Now, Eric, it's very interesting. I don't know what it means, if it means anything, but I have two friends, you and Brian Showers, who are expatriates. And Brian Showers is the publisher and editor of Swan River Press in Dublin. They're doing a book of mine, a small book of mine. Anyway, what you have in common is that you're evidently from New England. He's from Wisconsin, and you've moved to London and to Dublin, and have been there, I guess, for a long time. He might be about your age. Do you know Brian at all? Brian Showers?
I don't. Yeah, I don't think I've heard of him.
I should put you in contact with him, actually. So anyway, Brian has a predilection for Gothic literature. There's a lot of that in Ireland.
Yeah.
And there's some Americans, and a lot in England, so he's publishing very small, attractive little books. And he's going to be buying a house in Dublin, which is pretty expensive, I think. So what I'm saying is that both of you have American lives that you're not living. You opted not to live. Well, Hemingway did the same thing at about the same age. You opted not to live the quote American life that was sort of your kismet. It was set out for you. You would have gone here to college, you would have met somebody, you had a job here, you stayed here, you did this, you settled down, in other words, in North America, there is the other you.
Yeah.
And if you ever wanted to explore that as a fictitious project, you would find it very exciting and maybe trepidatious. Like there is an Eric Anderson that is the North American person, but you defied that. You didn't do it. So it sort of makes like the other you is sort of over there in the netherworld.
Yeah.
You could meet that other you, if you're writing that kind of wild fiction. What would that other you be? I find these possibilities thrilling and exciting.
And so was that what you were thinking of in the opening story of this collection, of like, what if you had stayed in your hometown and just and bought a used bookstore and stayed there, and yeah. Well,
everybody's got alternative lives that are pretty plausible. For instance, you got a scholarship not to Wisconsin but to Cornell there, and then you met somebody else. And you got married, and now you have different children, but there isn't anything really implausible about that. These are not implausible, wild fantasy lives. These are pretty likely lives. The average American, I think I read this, lives within about 70 miles of his or her birthplace. In other words, most people stay right around in that milieu they went to school with. Their relatives are there, their grandparents are buried there, they're staying really close to home. I think partly because they love the people, but also maybe fear of leaving. It takes some courage and audacity to just say, well, I'm leaving. I'm 23 years old and I'm going to live now in Rome, or I'm going to live in Ireland, I'm going to live in London, It takes a little more courage than the people you knew who just say, well, I think I'll just live down the block from my mother.
Yeah. And I think what's so tantalizing about this idea of, the other you and these sort of alternate lives we might have had is that so often the choice of the different paths that we could have taken are often like such a chance, isn't it? It's usually like a very small thing that occurs, or a decision that we might have made somewhat frivolously, or might have been an occurrence sort of out beyond our experience of being able to change it, and that really decided, such a different part of our lives. And yeah, and one thing I think is so interesting about how you handled this in this novel, where the narrative sort of diverges into two different paths, is that time takes on a very special meaning and is handled in a really interesting way. And I think how you write about that is, as you said before, it becomes a kind of loop, and it's aptly described at one point as being like a Mobius strip, and yet she finds this can't continue, and so the story does diverge in these two parallel lines simultaneously. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but like, as you said, the ending is ambiguous, and so that there are these two different paths at once. So I was wondering, was it difficult to actually construct and arrange this narrative because of this complexity?
Well, you probably noticed that these very short, I think they may be italicized chapters between the more realistic chapters, as if somebody is in a fever state, voice out of a fever state. So if something happens to you, you may have an infection, like the two of them at one point, before they go out to the Southwest, they're swimming in upstate New York in a lake. The lake is one of these lakes that's been warmed by the sun, and unnaturally warm. It doesn't get as cold, and it doesn't freeze as much any longer because of climate change. Mm-hmm. And so the bacteria or the amoeba that are in the water don't die out as much, or they multiply more. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And I did write a story about that. In fact, I think it's in The Other You, where I actually give a name to that dreadful amoeba that attacks the brain. So it's called the brain-eating amoeba, but it's certainly like a terrible fever or an infection. Mm. So I wanted there to be a sense, if one wants to read the novel this way, it's like moving Venetian blinds this way or turning them, reversing them. Mm-hmm. You could read the whole novel that Makala herself is in intensive care, and she is in a fever state. Her brain is swollen, and somebody seems to be saying to her at some point, well, this came through your ear and it came into your brain, and why did you wait so long before you came to us? As if she's gone to urgent care. Mm. Or the sort of intermittent passages could be more Jarrow rather than Makala. But I'm so fascinated by the fact that if something happens to our brains and we sort of wake up in a coma, or half wake up out of a coma, we won't really know what happened to us. But the reality that's in front of us is as real as it would have been if we had more of a context. Mm-hmm. In other words, when we're asleep and dreaming, we think we're awake. We're pretty sure we're awake, Mm-hmm. And if you hear a voice out of a fever cloud, someone's holding your hand and someone's talking to you, that's sort of like, that's your reality at that moment. So it's just possible that the whole novel and all the hallucinatory parts of the novel are her, the fever state that she's actually in. Mm. She and her husband went swimming in this lake, and we know that's happening more often, that people are getting infected with amoeba, a certain kind of amoeba with a very long Latin name, because of climate change. Mm-hmm. So you can only get infected actually if it goes up your nose into your brain. I think if you swallow it, it doesn't infect you, and possibly through the ear, but definitely up the nose. The brain, the nasal passages go right into the brain, and this goes into the brain, and that's the infection.
That's terrifying. Yeah.
Well, the novel has a lot to do with ecology and the environment, because I wanted to write about how the environment enters into us.
Mm.
You know, I think it must be in the other you. I think there's a little story, pre-postmortem, unless I didn't put that in. I
I'm
can't
trying to
read it. I
remember.
can't get my note. Pre-postmortem. Is that
Uh,
in it?
yeah, it's not in the other you. I think it must be in another collection, or maybe you just published it independently.
Maybe I just remembered it.
Hmm.
Maybe I didn't put it in. Okay, I was thinking of putting it in. But anyway, the pre-postmortem chapter is sort of in this, it is in here. I
Hmm.
mean, first it was a short story, first it was a chapter in the novel, and then it was a short story. And it was published in Conjunctions magazine. And now it's a short story again, but it's also in the novel because it's the same theme. It sounds completely crazy. You know, writing a novel, it's like a huge mosaic. We have a quilt. We have these parts that you're putting together, and you have a band around the outside, and you have things, but then you think, well, maybe I'll take that out. You know, so you take out one of the quilt, but then you don't remember it. And you think, well, where is it? Like, you look through the whole novel. Oh, because when I wrote Blonde, it was 1,400 pages in manuscript, and I had to I took out about 500 pages, which sounds insane. But a lot of what I took out, I still remember as if it's in, you know, like,
Yeah.
oh, I guess that's not in there. Like, what are we talking? You know, but then some of those chapters were published as stories. So they actually got out in the world, but they're not in Blonde. And some of them are in collections. Like I have a story called Three Girls.
Yeah, I love that short story
That
about
was
the
going,
girls that go into the Strand bookstore. Yeah.
that was going to be in the novel,
Hmm.
but it wasn't, you know, so that's the way you know that the writing is from the heart, because the writer is putting things here or putting there, but she has definitely lived through this so much that it seems like it's part of her own life.
But yeah, I did find that such an intriguing aspect of the novel. Those small tidbits and those small chapters where you get this sense that perhaps she does have an infection in the brain, and it's one of these things that, because they are so short, that it as you're reading the rest of the novel and other things are occurring, it's just something that I think is sort of lingering back in the back of the reader's mind, so that you're aware of it's there as a possibility, but you're more involved in the narrative of what's happening, of these much larger and dramatic things that are occurring to her as she's being terrorized by these ideas about this godlike figure, and but then also, yeah, struggling to carry on in her life and perform all the duties that she's, you know, sort of meant to be performing. And something I wanted to ask you about is this sense of the subjectivity of time seems to be a theme in your fiction in recent years, and it's led to some very innovative narratives where in the past, you've taken such a creative approach to representing time in different genres. So like in your Gothic fiction in Bellefleur and The Accursed, and of course your novel The Hazards of Time Travel, which could be classified as a science fiction novel. But I find it really fascinating how in your recent fiction, this creative approach to representing time seems to be being used more in your straightforwardly realistic fiction. And so I wonder if this is a technique of reworking how time is portrayed. If is this something you're sort of consciously developing, or is it just naturally occurring in the new fiction that you're writing because it suits the subject matter?
Well, it's hard to answer that, because basically a novel or long work of fiction is a text, and you have to structure it in a certain way so that there may be flashes to other times that are emotionally very important to a scene. So you have to have the flexibility that, as in the human brain with memory, we can move back to 1989, to April 1989, where something important happened to you. And you can kind of access that even though you're right here and your brain is still here, that some part of your brain magically can just somehow get back into that other time. And some people can shut their eyes and they can sort of vividly see some past room or house or person. I don't have that ability to actually see it, but you could sort of see conceptually. Mm-hmm. So I think because I'm so interested in the human brain and the way the brain works, its phantasmagoric powers, that I'm kind of exploring this phenomenon, how we're right here, but at the same time, in an instant, we can be thinking about 10 years old or 21 years old, or the last time I was in New York City, like all these times are sort of magically available to us. Mm. And so with the writing reflects that also. And then I'm so fascinated by, we were speaking of just sheer chance of how we're here and not rather there, or how you happen to be alive and somebody else is not alive, like how did that even happen? The chances seem so remote. So in a story I'm working on now, it takes place at a certain time, but it's mostly about something that happened 20 years earlier. So there's a kind of movement back and forth as the past is sort of being developed in a chronological way, and the present is kind of just spotty and intermittent. So as time goes on, we're more in the present eventually. We start off in 1991, I think, and then it sort of moves forward. So that takes a lot of thinking to make the transitions. And I spend a lot of time reshuffling. So the story is about 30 pages long now, but each time I look at it, I might go back and change something. And so it's like if you could go back to when you were 23 years old and change some little thing. Now today you'd be slightly different, have your ear pierced back then, and now you have this ear piercing. In other words, there's a consequence. So when you're working with multiple times, I think the writer does go back and keeps changing it to make it more fluent and fluid, so that it seems like it's a story unfolding rather than anything that's jarring. But I don't really mind a collage that's jarring either. That might work too, where there's no transition. Like, why should there be a transition? Maybe it should be a little more dramatic. So I have to kind of think about what the texture of the narrative is, if it's going to be rough and jarring, or is it going to be a little more melodic and more like Chopin. Like what tone do you want from your narrative? So with Breathe, I really did want a kind of elegiac tone. And there's not much here. There's not much that's brash or rude or vulgar or jocular or ironic. It's not a narrative that is postmodernist mockery. It's more elegiac and melancholy.
Yeah, it does have a quite melancholic tone to the whole novel, and I think you also write about the state of loneliness in a very moving way in the novel, and this is a subject that always preoccupies me, and there's one point in the novel where you state the perversity of loneliness, which is a terror of being alone and being not alone, like the systolic beating of a single heart. And I think this is such a beautifully accurate way to describe the peculiarity of loneliness, because so often, and I feel this, like so often when I'm in crowds, I can feel a strange sense of isolation, but when I'm physically on my own, then I can feel this sense of yearning, to connect with other people. And so it's a contradiction. And I wonder if you could speak about that a bit more, and if this is a state of being which you often feel yourself as well.
Well, I think we all do feel isolated and alone in a crowd of miscellaneous people, like The Lonely Crowd, David Reisman's book, the title of his book, The Lonely Crowd, that the more people there are sort of in a miscellaneous, promiscuous way, the less you feel any connection with them. But if you're just with one person, you may have such an absolute connection that you're never alone. You're with one person or two or three very close people. Or even by yourself alone doesn't mean that you'd be lonely. It's more of a state of mind. A person could be literally alone, but thinking thoughts that were connecting him or her to other people. Mikhail is very concerned with abandoning her husband. She doesn't want to abandon him. She feels very guilty about abandoning him. And I think that never really gets worked out for anybody. Like we are afraid of being abandoned as if we're still children. And people who are dying in the old days, people would die at home. The sick bed might be down in the living room. That's how Henry David Thoreau died. He was only in his 40s. Emily Dickinson probably died that way. Keats, everybody we can think of, they didn't die in hospitals. They died right in the bosom of the family, with the family right around them. So they were having conversations up until the last hour, because they weren't being kept alive, by a ventilator. They were not abandoned. I'm speaking ideally. I'm sure there were some who were, but let's say that the average experience in the past, the person is at home and there's no doctor anymore. Maybe there's some narcotics or pain medication or something. And so the people who are closest to them, the children or their spouse, they're really right there. But I think today there's this fear that people have of being literally abandoned, that you're in some cold clinical hospital place and your best friend can't even see you because he's not your family, or she's not your spouse and not your family. Some hospitals don't let people in those situations. That was a tragedy with AIDS patients, I think in the 1980s or so. Their partners were not allowed in their hospital rooms. Like, they died without the person they loved, and because they weren't married. And that may be why many gay people have gotten married, so that they will have that legal bond. That's a strong motivation, I think. So Mikhail is afraid of abandoning her husband. She is with him when he dies, but then she has to leave his body, and she's tormented by going away, and then his body's taken from the room. And at what point do you abandon somebody?
And I think one aspect of this, of her not wanting to abandon him, which I found very endearing, was the aspect of the story where she's endeavoring to revise a manuscript written by Gerard, which is playfully called The Human Brain and Its Discontents, rather than the civilization and its discontents. And I found it so touching how she persistently works on it, even when it becomes clear the manuscript has become an irretrievable mess with pages missing and uncompleted. But something I wanted to ask you is, since you personally seem so committed to completing fiction, which you've planned on writing, I was wondering if you ever have any ideas for novels or creative projects which you might write a draft of, but which you feel like you can't complete because either it's too difficult or too time consuming, but which might still linger in your imagination. So I was wondering if you've had that experience very much.
Oh yes, I have two novels that I've sort of I'm working on in a very vague way. Yeah. I a couple of years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I visited the Eudora Welty House in Jackson, Mississippi.
Mm,
And I really, really had such I mean, almost like a mystical experience. I really, really wanted to write a novel, not about Eudora Welty, but about a woman who becomes then enshrined in an actual house. And
mm,
I went back a second time. I took a whole lot of notes. I I have behind me on this table a folder just filled with lots of material about that. So when I finish whatever I'm working on now, it's possible I'll turn to that. I talked about this with Richard Ford, my friend who was a friend of Eudora Welty's, and he was her executor of her literary estate for a while.
mm,
And Richard thinks I should write this. I mean, I'm really excited about it. Now, whether I will actually write it is a matter of taking the time to do it. If
mhm,
I said, well, all right, I'll start working on that next Monday, nothing else, I could even move to another room in this house and say, only work on that.
mm,
And certainly I could do it. But for some reason, I don't feel I'm quite ready to do it. So I'm working on other things.
mm,
And I have another novel too that's a little less developed than that, by which I mean I have a lot of notes and plots and even some pages, quite a few pages, but I haven't started really seriously working about it.
I remember once in an interview you mentioned how you always wanted to write a novel about the artist Marsden Hartley, and I sort of wondered if you'd ever thought about like going back to that or like pursuing that project, since he was such a fascinating figure and artist. And
Well, did I say I want to write a novel about him? Because I wouldn't have that much emotional
or
connection.
maybe you said you wanted to write a like nonfiction piece about him or something, or
Oh, well,
maybe an
nonfiction
essay.
is different. I could do that, you know, there are very few people that historical people that I would have that strong wish to really saturate myself. Like I did once want to write a novel about Joe Louis,
Mm-hmm.
and I could possibly have done it. I mean, when writing like Marilyn Monroe, but because he's a great black boxer and I'm a white woman, I felt that maybe right now in our culture, that wouldn't even be a good idea to pursue. But there are not very many historical figures that we feel that much identification with or attention for or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be larger than life. Like Joe Louis is so much larger than his own life.
Mm-hmm.
Marilyn Monroe also. Well, Marlon Brando would be a possibility.
Mm. But of course,
But
you've written a book which is the collection of stories of wild nights, sort of reimagining these authors' lives. And I guess because you spend so much time reading these authors that you feel like you internalize them. I feel like it's almost a subset of literary fiction, of novels that are about other writers. And like Colm Toibin, he has a new novel coming out soon that fictionalizes the life of Thomas Mann. And Alison McLeod, she has a new novel coming out called Tenderness, which fictionalizes the life of D.H. Lawrence. And
oh,
so
that sounds
yeah.
interesting.
Mm. And so I think it's quite interesting how writers seem to like I guess because we take up so much time reading them that they can take up this like space in our imaginations. And then of course like Greg Johnson, he wrote this wonderful group of short stories about writers and like fictionalizing their lives.
Yeah, I'm definitely drawn to that. I find that really wonderful to make the character, the writer, come alive as a character, saying wonderful things, witty things, surprising things, shocking things.
Yeah, I just want to finish up by saying that reading this book is very moving and tense, and it's a haunting experience. And I'm going to be thinking about the surprising way it ends for quite some time, I think. So so congratulations on this publication of your new novel. And if I'm counting correctly, I think it's around the 60th full-length novel that you've published, which is quite an impressive accomplishment. And so I was wondering, finally, I just wanted to ask if, do you feel the same sense of excitement or trepidation about publishing a new book now as I assume you did when you first started publishing? Or is it changed?
The actual publication of the book doesn't seem to mean too much to me. I'm happy that people like you have read it. To me, the phenomenon of having written it and gotten through it, they often represent, certainly they represent epochs in my life or eras in my life that were challenging to get through. So it's like looking at a river that's very choppy water, and you think, well, did I really swim across that? Like with Blonde, it's like I swam across Lake Ontario. You always think, oh, I don't think I could do that again. I think, well, I did it. So you kind of swim across this body of water and you're all staggering and, anxious and falling down on the sand and all that. But you think, well, at least I got it done. I did it. So that's sort of how I feel about something like this. Certainly, because it's so much private emotion that I put into the novel. And if I open it almost anywhere, like the passage that you read about having faith or not having faith in science, there's so much of what I actually think and what would be in my head right now, if I have a conversation with someone, that it's almost like a little jarring, like, oh, did I actually put that down in the book? Because that's really what I thought. So I had to make sure that there was enough around Breathe that is fiction. Some of the characters, the ancillary characters, are fictitious people, and some of the incidents, or most of them, are they have a fictitious aspect to them, so that the whole thing isn't just a memoir. So like, what do you do with a memoirist work to make it a work of fiction? That is sort of an interesting subject too. Because some people, I think Erica Jong and many others, they basically write a memoir and then they change names, but they don't always change other things, So when you're reading it, you think, well, this is actually what really happened, but the names have been changed, or somebody's blonde instead of brunette. The changes are pretty cosmetic in some writing. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a transmogrified memoir that really was totally fiction, even though it was pretty much like that reality. But it's like completely changing the color and the musical score in the film, and changing the photography and the cinematography. Like, it's the same story, but everything has been made to change it.
Well, it's fascinating how you do that in this novel, and I think you said that the cover is actually a photo that Charlie took. Is that?
Yes, in Bryce Canyon. Yeah. But to sort of make it a cover and a work that's not a beautiful photograph, the designer, the art director started fading it. So, I wish I had thought about this. I could have brought. Should I go and get the picture?
Sure. Yeah. You can step away and I can edit it.
Yeah, I'll be right there.
Oh, wow.
So I have sort of a large house. I had to walk to find this. So I don't know whether you can see it so clearly, but so the actual.
Wow.
So the actual photograph is much starker.
Yeah, there are like so many dark aspects in the canyon, and the delineation between the blue sky and the darkness of the top.
Yeah, so to appropriate that for a cover, there are these faded things which you wouldn't have in the original. the original photograph is much more beautiful than the cover. But I think they felt they didn't want to have anything like travel log, you know. The scenes of Bryce Canyon of the American Southwest are so dazzlingly beautiful that ironically you can't really use them much as covers because they're so beautiful. And they would seem not that your eye would just sort of look at that beauty.
But I think it is also how they've done this with the white streaks on the side. It is also partly reflective of how Michaela is sort of disappearing to herself. And so it's like the photograph is almost disappearing, but there's Lilith, right? Yeah.
Lilith is she's not so photogenic as, oh, come on. Oh, Xanchi loves the camera, but Xanchi, I think, is outside. Disappointing.
Well, got to see her briefly.
Lilith is very friendly and affectionate, but she just doesn't somehow have that love of the camera.
She's a bit shy, that's all. Yeah.
She's a bit shy, yeah. I'm so sorry that Xanchi's not here. Well, next time we speak, Xanchi will definitely be here.
Okay.
I promise.
Well, it's been so lovely talking to you, and thank you so much for having this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. It's always so much fun to talk with you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.